MacAskill.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This debate goes to the heart of two Scottish institutions. Firstly, Caledonian McBrain, CalMac, who provide lifeline services to the Scottish Highlands and Islands, and whose ships are acquired for them by Caledonian Maritime Assets Limited, CMAL, both Scottish Government agencies. And secondly, Ferguson Marine Engineering Limited, FEMAL, who operated the last shipyard on the Lower Clyde, a river that made ships admired around the world, yet a yard which has been excluded from the most recent CMAL tender to build CalMac ships and where orders are going abroad. CalMac and Ferguson's are part of Scotland's story, but they're also vital to Scotland's future. Communities devastated by incessant breakdowns and cancellations need a fast and reliable service to maintain them and allow them to grow. For that, new ships are required. Not only should Ferguson's be building them, but others from elsewhere, and indeed not just in Port Glasgow, but on other sites that can be revitalised the length of the Clyde. Instead, CalMac is floundering, and Ferguson's future is threatened. In 2014, Ferguson's was saved by the intervention of Jim McCall, and all looked rosy. What's gone wrong? Why have vessels 801 and 802 been so delayed, costs overrun so massively, and Ferguson Marine Engineering Limited gone into liquidation? At the core are procurement and administration, both issues reserved to Westminster. I hope that ministers may be able to provide answers, if not an inquiry into what's a scandal that needs resolved. Firstly, let me rebut suggestions that the yard or workforce were to blame. History shows what the Clyde can do, and the same skills still remain at Ferguson's. Moreover, research by RMT Union has shown that of the 8 ships that have broken down recently, only 2 were built in the Clyde, and they were amongst the oldest, where difficulties could be expected. CMAL recognised the skills when placing the order there for ships 801 and 802. In evidence at the Scottish Parliament's Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee, Jim Anderson, Director of Vessels, stated, "The shipyard was already building ships for us. It had a good history of building those type of ships." Even more convincing was Commodore Luc van Beek, a Dutch maritime expert appointed by the Scottish Government. He said, "I was in no doubt it had the management expertise. Having rebuilt the yard, Ferguson Marine had a good shipbuilding system in place." For sure, there'll have been mistakes made, and more that perhaps could have been done, but it was and remains a skilled workforce, and Jim McCall and his company have a global reputation for engineering prowess. His initial intervention was lauded by the Scottish Government. The suggestion that he can succeed around the world, but not in Scotland's absurd. Procurement and liquidation lie at the heart of this mess. Responsibility rests with CMAL and the Scottish Government. Dealing first with procurement, there are 2 aspects: the contract specification and the requirement for the vessels to be dual fuel. That's operating on both marine diesel and LNG. Dealing firstly with the contracts, it's clear what was signed off by CMAL was lacking in specification, and from that most problems arose. A design and build contract for a ship at an initial price of £97 million, but many other critical factors weren't clear. That was a recipe for discord, indeed disaster. Costs rose as changes kept being made. Just what was to be built, never entirely clear. As Jim McCall said, we would normally expect the specification to be more fleshed out. Continuing, price was based on the specification that were had at the time. As we've said, it was not detailed at that time, there were still some open ends that we had to resolve collaboratively with CMAL. The second issue was fuelling. Leaving aside why environmentally you even consider LNG, there remain basic engineering concerns. It's a relatively new technology, normally used on larger vessels than on smaller ones like ships 801 and 802, where other options, such as batteries or hydrogen, are preferred. Whatever may be suggested by CMAL or the Scottish Government, dual-fuel LNG was the diktat of CMAL, not the want of CalMac. As Van Beek said, 801 and 802 were not the ships CalMac wanted, adding, "When I met the chief executive of CalMac, I was very surprised to discover that it was not and had not been involved, except in having made some observations right at the beginning of the process when it said that it did not want LNG ships." It's also not surprising that CalMac didn't want LNG ships, as there's no LNG infrastructure in Scottish ports. I asked CMAL what consideration was given to onshore supply systems, what was in situ at the time of requisition, and what the situation is now for LNG. This, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the answer. At the time, the only load-out facility in the UK was the Isle of Grain. There were 3 projects looking at the bulk storage in Scotland, 2 on the east coast and 1 on the west coast. So far, none of these have been built out. CalMac operates in the Hebrides and on the Clyde, which lie on Scotland's west coast, the Isle of Butes in the latter, and the Isle of Lewis the former. But the Isle of Grain is in Kent, on England's east coast. No wonder CalMac didn't want it. Having messed up the tender, CMAL proceeded to make a bad situation worse. When cooperation between shipbuilder and vessel procurer was needed, CMAL refused to cooperate. That's confirmed once again by Van Beek, who said CMAL had no interest in compromising, most damningly adding, "The people who I met from CMAL were adamant that they did not want to discuss ways to make the situation better." Female offered mediation. CMAL refused. This was the modern equivalent of the Titanic racing into the iceberg. But it was known to the Scottish Government, as Van Beek added and made clear. He said, "I said exactly the same thing when I briefed Mr Mackay. I said that the relationship between the customer and the client was broken, and that some things that CMAL were doing were very unhelpful." Mr Mackay was Derek Mackay, the Scottish Finance Secretary. So knowing all that, what did the Scottish Government do? Remove CMAL? No. They remain running the show and tendering for vessels abroad when work's needed on the Clyde. Instead, they forced female into liquidation. As Jim McCall said in evidence, the Scottish Government didn't save the yard from administration. They forced it into administration by repeatedly refusing to instruct CMAL to engage in reasonable requests for mediation, an expert witness process, or arbitration. Administration wasn't the recommendation made by their own expert advisor, Commodore Van Beek. He advised arbitration. Instead, the Scottish Government chose administration. Why? Well, I'm afraid Mr Van Beek can't help us, as he said, "I have no idea why he chose that route. It was against my advice." He was once again Derek Mackay, who said that the CMAL board would resign en masse if he interfered. Many communities might have said, accept their resignations with alacrity. Hear, hear. By the time we get to the Scottish Parliament inquiry, the Scottish Government line was contractor error was to blame. That was put forward by Paul Wheelhouse, then the Islands Minister. Why were neither the First Minister nor the then Finance Secretary called to give evidence? Rather than the senior ministers directly involved, it was left to a junior minister with no prior involvement to speak for the government, putting forward a position that wasn't the view of the government's own expert, who'd been supportive of female getting the contract, critical of CMAL's actions, and who suggested arbitration, not administration. More damningly, if the contractors were responsible, why did the First Minister meet privately with Mr McCall when the dispute between female and CMAL was raging, out with the presence and even knowledge of CMAL, and providing significant financial assistance to female? If the contractor was in error, why keep funding them? Moreover, why ignore the advice of your own expert? No wonder the Scottish Parliament concluded that there has been a catastrophic failure in the management of the procurement of vessels 801 and 802, leading it to conclude that the processes and structures are no longer fit for purpose. Liquidation followed, but the question of this whole saga only increased. On 14th August 2019, Female went into liquidation. Female, aware of their financial difficulties, had already engaged KPMG to act in the administration they saw looming. But the Scottish Government appointed Deloitte, insisting that any administrator appointed had to be acceptable to CMAL. As disclosed to Lord Tyre in a related court case, Deloitte and the Scottish Government had been contingency planning, and the former were appointed by the latter, despite the Scottish Government being only the second-ranking creditor and yet also the largest debtor. On 16th August, Deloitte arrived at the yard, the same day as the Scottish Government declared publicly that it had nationalised it. Yet administrators required to consider the position and speak to all creditors before any disposal can take place. None had, but the position wasn't challenged by Deloitte. It would be some time before the administration was finalised, and the yard wasn't formally taken over by the government until 2nd December. Instead, what happened was that Deloitte, having been appointed administrators at the behest of the Scottish Government, in turn appointed Microcom to run the yard. Microcom are a company wholly owned by Scottish ministers. Deloitte also refused to pursue any potential claim had by Female, now in liquidation, against CMAL, something that could have been substantial and might also have offered some clarity. Former senior staff have been moved on and had non-disclosure agreements signed. Why? Surely experience was needed at that juncture and information should be publicly available. Questions therefore arise regarding the liquidation and the role of administrators. These actions have been raised with the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales, and questions asked as to whether they acted with objectivity and integrity. Hopefully that will be advised soon. As things now stand, the yard's operated by the Scottish Government, but though salaries of senior management grow exponentially, progress is still slow on ships 801 and 802. At the time of liquidation, work on military vessels had been agreed with Babcock's. Fishing support vessels were being built with more to be won, and work was ongoing on the world's first hydrogen propulsion system, which had received an international award. Yet now, islands are still bereft of services, communities and businesses threatened, and the yard's worried about its future as CMAL tenders orders abroad and other orders have been lost. By all means.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I wonder, as the biographer of the late Jimmy Reid, if he shares my concern that this whole sorry affair and the Scottish Government's involvement in it renders their protestations about Type 26 frigates risible and is deeply damaging to the proud history of shipbuilding on the Clyde?
Well, I think I would agree with my honourable friend on that. The history of Scottish shipbuilding is a fantastic record, but it also has a future. But to have a future, it has to be not simply on the upper Clyde, it has to be on the lower Clyde. So that takes me to what needs done. There needs to be clarity on Seamill's actions and the role of government ministers responsible. A public inquiry should be held. The Holyrood inquiry suggested an independent external review. That, I believe, is inadequate. This straddles reserved and devolved competencies. Will the Minister consider seeking to establish a joint inquiry with the Scottish Government, as happened, for example, with the Stockline explosion? Moreover, for the communities involved and for Scotland's industrial future, actions needed. To use football parlance, sack the board and remove the manager. CMAL should be abolished. CalMac, in consultation with the communities who must have rights, should be responsible for the selection of ships.
Hear, hear.
The management team that has been put into Ferguson's needs removed.
Hear, hear.
The replacement of the CalMac fleet that will involve several vessels a year and over decades to come should be placed out to tender, but with the stipulation that Ferguson's and other sites in Scotland must be used for their construction by whoever wins it. Madam Deputy Speaker, we need clarity on what went wrong, but fundamentally, we need to secure a ferry service for our remote communities and provide a future for our shipyards on the Lower Clyde.
Hear, hear.
Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I begin by congratulating the honourable gentleman for East Lothian for securing this debate. And I will turn to the important points and questions he has raised shortly, although I do have to say at the outset these are a matter for the Scottish Government and not for me to answer. However, I first want just to put this debate in the context of shipbuilding in Scotland more generally. As a global trading island nation with a proud maritime history, shipbuilding is an important part of our industrial identity. Scotland, like every part of the United Kingdom, offers much to our security, sovereignty and prosperity, and plays a critical role in the collective defence of our region and global interests. My department has been working closely with the Ministry of Defence to deliver on our ambition to support military shipbuilding in Scotland, and the industry there currently benefits most from MOD expenditure. The Secretary of State for Defence, in his role as Shipbuilding Czar, is acutely aware of the value of shipbuilding in Scotland. He is leading work across government to deliver on his vision to support industry across the Union, enabling it to become more productive, innovative and competitive. UK naval shipbuilding is currently centred around BAE Systems, Scotstoun and Govan shipyards and Babcock's Rosyth shipyard, which also have strong naval export markets. These yards are producing the Type 26 and Type 31 frigates, two crucial naval procurements. Three of the Type 26 ships, HMS Glasgow, HMS Cardiff and HMS Belfast, are under construction on the Clyde. Manufacture of these new, highly capable ships is securing about 1,700 skilled shipbuilding jobs in Scotland and some 4,000 jobs through the supply chain across Britain until 2035. On the 23rd of September this year, the Shipbuilding Czar officially cut steel for HMS Venturer, the first of the Royal Navy's Type 31 frigates, during a ceremony held at Rosyth Dockyard. The event marks a significant milestone in the programme for the Royal Navy Defence and shipbuilding in Scotland, with all 5 vessels to be built by Babcock on the 1st of Forth and an average production cost of £250 million per vessel. The Type 31 contract, awarded in November 2019 and to run until 2028, has led to a £71 million infrastructure investment for the dockyard and sustains 130 apprenticeships and 20 graduate positions. Last month, my noble and honourable friend, the Minister of State, Baroness Goldie, had the opportunity to speak with some of Babcock's current apprentices to hear firsthand how their academic interest in STEM has led to a career in defence manufacturing. Since March 2020 to present, Babcock has supported approximately 300 apprentices, mostly from the local area of Dunfermline and West Fife. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Scotland, recently visited the Govan shipyard, where he was briefed on the Type 26 programme by Simon Lister, head of BAE's Naval Ships Business, and had the opportunity to engage with employees and trade union representatives. Our National Shipbuilding Strategy Refresh will be published later this year, and this strategy will set out how the Government intends to set the conditions for success in the UK shipbuilding industry, both domestically and for exports, and how the Government will work with industry to create lasting transformation. Scottish yards are also likely to benefit from the new investment in the Type 32 multi-role ocean surveillance and multi-role support ships, and the Royal Fleet Auxiliary Landing Ship conversion. The Shipbuilding Strategy Refresh will set out how this Government will provide further support to industry on export and how it will engage with overseas partners to secure export successes. Indeed, my noble friend, the Lord Offord, was in India just the other week, helping to explore the potential for future export orders. A regular drumbeat of design and manufacturing work in UK yards is needed to maintain the industrial capabilities important for UK national security and to drive efficiencies which will reduce longer-term costs in the shipbuilding portfolio and help secure further export success. A sustainable pipeline of orders, as the Honourable Gentleman has indicated, is clearly necessary to build and maintain a skilled workforce. I'll happily give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, it's good to see a debate taking place in this House on a company based in my constituency of Inverclyde. In fact, 3, Seamal, Calder, McBrain and Ferguson, all based in Inverclyde. It would have been nice to have been notified this debate was going to happen in this chamber. I would expect that to be a courtesy extended to me by the Honourable Member for East Lothian. And I share your optimism for British shipbuilding and what we're building in Ferguson Marine. After all the troubles it's had, and yes, it's a stormy journey, it will be retooled, new shedding, a re-energised workforce with 40 apprentices working out of there. 5, 6, 7 years ago, you could not have said that. So my hope for Inverclyde and for Ferguson Marine is a successful and buoyant future.
I'm grateful for the Honourable Gentleman's intervention. I'm afraid it's not for me to intervene on a family feud, if I can put it that way, with the Honourable Gentleman for East Lothian, but I am well aware that there are traditional courtesies that should be maintained. And I am glad to hear that there is an optimism in the Honourable Gentleman's constituency. I did have the pleasure of visiting Greenock, and I do believe I gave him due notice of that, particularly to look at the new ocean liner terminal, which I hope will bring increased tourist footfall to his part of the world. But to return to the point of my speech, it is very clear that the UK Government recognises, and we will show our support for the future of shipbuilding in Scotland through all the means we have available, namely in the form of military spending and support. I am well aware, to turn to some of the Honourable Gentleman for East Lothian's points, I am well aware of the challenges that there are in providing reliable ferry services, particularly to the rural and island communities in Scotland. But I do have to say that when we've received various representations as the UK Government on the lack of suitable ferries in Scotland, we were firmly told by the Scottish Government that this was a process for them and not for us. And I will take an intervention.
Just to accept that procurement and indeed liquidation and administration are aspects of company law that are reserved to Westminster. And on that basis, would the Minister be prepared to meet with me so that we can discuss the concerns that I and many others, not simply in Inverclyde but in Scotland, have about the process that has taken place, and which it might be the responsibility for the ordering of the services and indeed the payment for the ships, But the law under which procurement and administration is carried out, as I mentioned with regard to the Institute for Accountants for England and Wales, is reserved to Westminster.
Well, indeed, the framing of company law is a reserved matter. I would need to take advice from officials as to whether a breach of that law was a reserved matter, or I suspect more a devolved one. But if you'll allow me, I will take guidance from my officials on that. Very happy to.
I'm grateful to the Minister for taking an intervention. We've been discussing tonight reserved issues and devolved issues, and that's something that pupils at Logie Primary School this week will be looking at through the UK Parliament Week. And I wondered if the Scotland Office Minister would congratulate the young people at Logie Primary School and the staff for their interest in the UK Parliament Week. I'll be seeing them on Friday, and I'm sure one of the questions I might get asked is, how do you get a mention of Logie Primary School and UK Parliament Week into an adjournment debate about shipbuilding?
Well, I'm happy to say my honourable friend has given them a masterclass in how to do that. And if I can refer it back to the subject for this debate, I very much hope amongst the pupils at Logie Primary that amongst their number we will see future mariners, future shipbuilders, future engineers and future technicians. And I wish them all very well in their future endeavours. I would say that I was surprised to see that the procurement of these new ferries in Scotland did not include Ferguson Marine to tender for those new ferries to Islay. The delays of the two ships currently under construction may well have played a part in that, but that again is not for me to comment on at this stage. I would just say it is very disappointing that these ships, given the maritime history and shipbuilding history in the Clyde and Scotland more generally, that they could not be included and are being lost to overseas orders. But as I say, these are matters primarily for the Scottish Government to answer. The Honourable Gentleman should pose them to his former colleagues in Holyrood and the Scottish Government. But for the UK Government's perspective, we are investing in the future of Scottish shipbuilding. It demonstrates the strength of our union, and I hope to see many more ships built on the Clyde. Thank you very much.